Candy, the Wright paradox. In 2065, the world was accustomed to the hum of drones in the sky, silent, efficient, and with an accuracy that humans could only dream of. They brought food, supplies, and even repaired satellites in orbit. But on a cold morning in late September, something inexplicable happened. Hundreds of supersonic AI-guided drones across the eastern United States, including a fleet near Washington, D.C., suddenly lost power mid-flight and plummeted to the earth. The world watched as debris rained down in a perfect storm of metal and shattered technology. The news cycle was dominated by the mystery. What could cause machines designed to never fail to suddenly drop out of the sky? Candy Matsuda was watching too, but she was more than just a casual observer. As an aerospace engineer turned rogue historian, she had seen the development of technology from the inside out and knew the implications of something like this. She didn't believe in coincidence. This wasn't just a malfunction, it was a deliberate sabotage. Her investigation began in the most unlikely place, a dusty library in the heart of North Carolina, not far from Kitty Hawk, the birthplace of aviation. If history had taught her anything, it was that the answer was often buried in the past. The drones had crashed in the present, but the cause of their failure could very well lie in the distant past, in 1903 to be exact. That was the year the Wright brothers made their first successful flight, changing the course of human history. Candy's theory was simple but radical. Somewhere along the timeline of human progress, a rupture had occurred, a fracture that extended back to the first flight at Kitty Hawk. She didn't know how, but she suspected someone was manipulating history itself, undoing the very act that had given humanity the skies. And somehow, this sabotage had created a ripple effect that had reached the year 2065, where drones fell from the sky. Her journey took her to a small, off-the-grid lab in the outskirts of the city, one that specialized in quantum chronometry, a technology that could detect shifts in time itself. Inside, an eccentric old professor greeted her with the skepticism that only a person entrenched in academia could muster. But Candy's reputation preceded her, and after an hour of probing, the professor admitted there was something strange going on. Temporal anomalies, disruptions in the past. She couldn't make sense of it, but something, some force, was actively rewriting history. As Candy delved deeper into the issue, she discovered the unimaginable. There was a bootleg timeline, a timeline where the Wright brothers' first flight had ended in disaster, spiraling the world's aviation history backward instead of propelling it forward. A timeline where flight was delayed for decades, where aviation technology was never properly developed, and the world moved on in a warped, distorted fashion. The deeper she went, the more questions arose. Why would anyone sabotage the Wright brothers? And why would they do so with such precision, knowing that the ripples would reach the future? The answer wasn't just historical, it was political and technological. It was only when she discovered a group known as the aerospace, a technocratic cult operating from the shadows of the 23rd century, that the puzzle pieces started to fall into place. The aerospace had one clear goal: to erase aviation history altogether. In their vision, eliminating the Wright brothers' success would have a profound effect on the course of history, particularly the trajectory of global conflict, environmental collapse, and surveillance states. The aerospace believed that flight, military aircraft, commercial airliners, and even the innocuous drone had been the catalyst for countless wars, climate catastrophes, and surveillance infrastructures. They argued that if humanity had never developed the technology for flight, it would have avoided these mistakes. Without the ability to fly, nations could not project military power across borders. Without air travel, there would be no need for mass surveillance systems that track the movement of billions. Without the emissions from planes, the Earth's ecosystems would have been spared. Candy soon realized the scale of the conspiracy. A small, elite faction of the 23rd century had discovered a way to manipulate time itself. By tampering with the Wright brothers' first flight, they had set in motion a chain of events that ultimately led to the collapse of aviation, and in their view, the salvation of humanity. But the consequences of their intervention were dire. The absence of planes had led to a world that, while free of war and climate change, had become emotionally barren. People no longer experienced the beauty of travel, the joy of discovery. The rich diversity of cultures, once nurtured by long journeys and the exchange of ideas, had collapsed into something sterile and fractured. In the alternate future, humanity had developed teleportation technology, but it came with a devastating cost. The teleportation network created a borderless world, one where individuals could go anywhere in the blink of an eye. But without the need for travel, the sense of place, of home, of identity had vanished. Entire regions, once rich in culture, became indistinguishable. Memories of ancient landscapes, old traditions, and the stories passed down through generations were erased as people moved freely without the need to settle anywhere. It was a perfect world in one sense. There was no war, no environmental degradation, no disease, but it was a hollow one. People lived disconnected from one another, emotionally adrift in a universe that lacked meaning. The fragility of human connection, the very thing that made life beautiful, had been lost. Everything was the same, everywhere. The perfect stillness of the world, without planes, without borders, was a cold and lonely one. Candy had seen enough. She had to make a choice. To stop the aerolysis, she would need to restore the Wright Brothers' flight. But that wasn't just about saving history, it was about saving the essence of humanity itself. She would have to confront the consequences of a timeline where the Wright brothers never flew and all of human history was altered because of it. She also had to confront a deeper truth. The price of restoring the flight might very well mean the return of the very conflicts, surveillance, and environmental damage that the aerolysis had hoped to erase. Would the world be better off without flight, without the chaos that came with it? Or would humanity be better off with the messy, imperfect world of aviation, where travel, cultures, and connections still held meaning, even if they came with their own costs? The weight of that decision bore down on her as she traced the threads of time back to Kitty Hawk. If she failed, the world might fall into the sterile, disconnected future the aerolysis wanted to create. If she succeeded, the skies might once again be filled with the hum of aircraft, and with it, the complexities of a world that had never been perfect, but always alive. She stood at the edge of the future, looking back into the past, trying to make sense of it all. Would she save history, or would she let the past be rewritten, letting the perfect future of teleportation become reality? Only time would tell. Candy's mind raced as she absorbed the weight of what she had uncovered. The clock was ticking, the paradox stretching ever further. The aerolysis were an insidious force, operating from the future with tools far beyond anything her own time could comprehend. But they had one major flaw. They were trying to erase the past without truly understanding it. They had mistaken the complexities of history for chaos, when in reality, it was those very complexities that kept the world from falling into a sterile monotony. The decision was clear. She had to act fast. She needed to get back to Kitty Hawk and make sure the Wright brothers achieved their first flight. But there was one problem. She wasn't the only one chasing history. In the depths of the shadows, another organization had been tracking Candy's every move. The Temporal Order, a secretive group of historians and rogue technologists, had also detected the rift in time. They had their own agenda: to control the timeline, to ensure that history followed the path they deemed appropriate. Unlike the aerolysis, they weren't seeking to erase history. They were looking to bend it to their will. The Temporal Order had no qualms about manipulating events to preserve their version of reality, and they saw Candy as a threat to their own designs. Candy's first instinct was to flee, but she quickly realized she couldn't. The Temporal Order had already infiltrated the system she had used to track down the anomalies. Every piece of technology in her possession was now compromised. Every contact in the world of history altered or blocked. If she wanted to succeed, she would have to rely on her own wits, and perhaps the help of some unexpected allies. Her journey led her to a small, clandestine group of individuals who called themselves the Preservationists. They were a collective of historians, engineers, and scientists who had, for years, operated outside of mainstream research, preserving the true timeline from interference. They were the forgotten protectors of history, operating in the shadows, often unseen by the world at large. They had anticipated the risk of temporal disruptions and had developed methods to track and respond to any significant shifts in history. The leader of the preservationists, a sharp-minded woman named Evelyn, greeted Candy with a cautious but welcoming air. Evelyn had heard of the aerolysis and the temporal order, but Candy's story was far more urgent. Evelyn had her own theories about the damage being done to history, and she agreed with Candy. The only way to ensure the Wright brothers took flight and the timeline remained intact was to work together. The preservationists would offer Candy shelter, resources, and access to an underground network of time trackers who could help her pinpoint the exact moment when the Wright brothers' first flight had been sabotaged. It wasn't long before Candy found herself deep inside a hidden bunker, surrounded by archaic computers and devices that hummed with the quiet power of untraceable technology. Evelyn and the preservationists worked with a kind of urgency that Candy hadn't seen in years. The plan was simple. They would go back in time, right to the moment before the Wright brothers attempted their flight. They would observe the event and, if necessary, intervene at the exact moment the sabotage occurred. But there was a catch. The preservationists had never attempted anything like this. Time travel was inherently dangerous, and even small changes could cause devastating ripples. To alter the past was to invite chaos. "You're not just saving the Wright brothers," Evelyn told Candy as the team prepped the machines. "You're making sure that everything we've come to know, our present, our future, doesn't unravel. You're holding the thread of reality in your hands." Candy understood the gravity of the mission, but she also understood something else. This wasn't just about saving aviation. It was about saving humanity's future from a future that had already tried to erase its soul. The machine they used was a marvel of modern engineering, a quantum nexus, a prototype capable of projecting its user back in time within a very narrow window. The window was small, and the risks were enormous. A minor glitch in the system, a slight error in judgment, and Candy could find herself stuck in a fractured timeline forever. There was no going back once she crossed the threshold. Candy stood in front of the machine, staring at the glowing lines of code running across the screen. The hum of the device filled the room, and a cold rush of adrenaline surged through her veins. It was her moment. She couldn't back out now. The future depended on it. She stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest as she strapped herself into the device. The room around her faded, and she felt her body displace itself in time, the world spinning in a blur of colors and fractured moments. She fought to focus, to hold on to her sense of self. Then, with a sudden jolt, the world snapped back into focus. She was standing on a patch of land. The wind whipped through her hair, and the air smelled of fresh earth and salt. It was the outer edge of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, 1903. She had arrived at the moment that had to be preserved. In the distance, she could see the small hangar where the Wright brothers were preparing their aircraft. She felt a sense of awe as she watched them work. These men were on the cusp of something that would change the world forever. But there was no time for awe. Candy's eyes scanned the area, searching for the one thing that could derail history, the anomaly. She knew it could come in any form: a stranger, a piece of technology, or even a seemingly innocent comment. The ripples of history could be disturbed in the smallest of ways. Suddenly, she noticed something strange. A shadow moved just out of view behind the hangar. It was a figure dressed in modern clothing, its silhouette unmistakable. Someone from the future, one of the aerolysis or the temporal order, was here. They had found a way to travel back to this exact moment in time. Without thinking, Candy sprinted toward the hangar. She needed to reach the Wright brothers before the stranger did. She could already hear the voices of Orville and Wilbur, the brothers talking excitedly about their flight, unaware of the danger lurking just behind them. As she rounded the corner, she saw him, a tall man dressed in a manner that was entirely out of place for 1903. His clothing was sleek, futuristic, and he was standing next to the aircraft, fiddling with its controls. Candy's heart raced. This was it. The sabotage had begun. She rushed forward, shouting, "Stop!" The man turned, his face a mask of cold indifference. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice laced with an unsettling calm. "You don't understand what's at stake." Candy squared her shoulders, determined. "I understand exactly what's at stake. If you do this, you'll erase everything. History, humanity, the future. You're wrong, he interrupted, stepping closer. By letting the Wright brothers fly, you'll ensure a future of endless war, pollution, and surveillance. The only way forward is to stop this, before it even starts. Candy stared at him, trying to read the logic in his words. Was this man truly trying to save the future? Or was he simply blinded by his ideology? There was no time to question further. With a sharp breath, she moved into action, grabbing a wrench from the nearby table and wrenching the device from the stranger's hand before he could make another move. The figure backed away, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. You don't understand the consequences of your actions? I understand more than you know, Candy retorted, and I'm not letting you rewrite history. In that moment, the choice was made. She had to ensure the flight took place, no matter the cost. The man didn't react immediately. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on her as if trying to decide whether to fight or retreat. Time seemed to slow, the distant sound of the ocean and the fluttering of the aircraft's fabric, the only sounds breaking the silence. Then with a swift motion, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small metallic device. Candy's eyes widened. A temporal disruptor. She had heard of these. Compact devices used to create micro-rifts in time, capable of temporarily freezing moments or displacing them. This man wasn't just trying to stop the Wright brothers' flight, he was trying to erase it completely. Before she could react, he pressed the device to the ground. A low hum filled the air, followed by a sharp crackle. The ground beneath her feet shifted, distorting as if the very fabric of reality were warping. She felt her mind swirl in a haze, her vision blurring as though the world itself was flickering in and out of focus. Then just as quickly as it had started, the distortion stopped. Candy staggered backward, disoriented, her legs threatening to buckle beneath her. "What did you do?" she gasped, struggling to keep her balance. The man simply smiled, a cold, almost pitying smile. "You can't stop this, Candy. The timeline is already in motion. History has been altered." He turned and began to walk away, his movements deliberate. "Your Wright brothers will never fly. Not today, not ever." Panic surged in her chest as she reached for her own temporal tracker, a small, hidden device she had brought with her, hoping to use it in case things went wrong. But it was gone. In the midst of the disruption, the device had been swept from her hand, its signal lost in the fracture. "No," she muttered, gritting her teeth. She couldn't let this happen. She darted after him, her heart hammering in her chest. There was no time for hesitation. She had to stop him, no matter the cost. The Wright brothers couldn't be allowed to fail. Not here, not now. But the man was already at the edge of the runway, stepping toward the small gathering of spectators, a few curious onlookers who had gathered to witness the event. The wind picked up, whipping his coat behind him like a shadow. The aircraft, the flyer, stood at the ready, its engines powered, the brothers preparing for the launch. Candy sprinted forward, her eyes locked on the man who was now standing at the edge of the crowd. He was too close. She could see the faintest flicker of movement in his hand. He was setting up another disruptor. "No!" she shouted, her voice breaking the calm morning air. The man turned, looking at her with a faint, almost sad smile. "I warned you," he said softly, the device now fully visible in his palm. "History is fragile. It cannot be allowed to continue down this path. You can't save them, Candy." In that instant, she saw her choice clearly. She had no time to think about the consequences, no time to consider the future. If she didn't act now, the timeline would be severed, and everything she had worked for would be in vain. With a cry of defiance, Candy lunged toward the man, knocking his arm just as he pressed the button. The disruptor flared to life, but it wasn't the cataclysmic ripple she had feared. Instead, it erupted into a blinding flash of light, a flare that temporarily blinded her, disorienting her senses. She stumbled backward, struggling to stay upright. But in the chaos, something strange happened. The moment stretched. Time itself wavered, flickering as though it were unraveling at the edges. Candy could feel it, an intense pressure, as if the very timeline was being rewritten around her. The world slowed, like syrup thickening in a pan, and in that split second, she realized what had happened. The disruptor had triggered not just a rift in the past, but a ripple that affected the flow of time. The timeline had split, and now she was trapped in an alternate version of this moment, a frozen second between one reality and another. Desperately, she struggled to think through the haze. She had to reset the timeline. The Wright brothers couldn't fail. They couldn't. Candy's hand shot out, grabbing the disruptor from the man's fingers as he staggered back in confusion. She twisted the device, trying to reverse the effect, but the controls were unfamiliar. The hum of the disruptor grew louder, vibrating in her hands. It was a race against time, a race to realign history before it slipped beyond reach. But just then, the sound of engines filled the air, and Candy's heart skipped. The flyer was moving. It was happening. Wilbur Wright was at the controls, and Orville stood by, ready to run alongside the plane. The brothers were taking off. Despite the disruption, despite the chaos, they were flying. Candy breathed a sigh of relief, but the man wasn't finished yet. His expression hardened, a flicker of anger flashing across his face. He lunged for the disruptor in her hands. "No, you don't understand what you're doing," he yelled. This was it. Candy had a moment to act. With one fluid motion, she threw the disruptor as far as she could. It soared through the air, its hum cutting off as it hit the ground far beyond the reach of both of them. The disruption would stop. The world seemed to hold its breath. For a split second, the sky cleared, and the time bubble around her collapsed. The ground felt solid beneath her feet once more. The world around her snapped back into place. The Wright brothers' flyer was airborne, cutting through the sky like it was always meant to. The moment had been saved. The man standing still with shock on his face watched the plane climb higher, the whir of its wings growing fainter in the distance. Candy took a step back, her breath ragged, her mind spinning. She had done it. She had restored the timeline. But as the man disappeared into the distance, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't over. This moment, the success of the Wright brothers, was merely the beginning. There were still forces at work, manipulating time for their own ends, trying to shape history into something they could control. And Candy Matsuda wasn't about to let them win.